Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We are continuing to learn Hilchas Sukkah, and we're going to be learning today Mirz Hashem Daf Kuf Amid Beis. We are going to pick up on the bottom of Kuf Amid Aleph. Now, even though we really began Siman Tov Reish Lamed Zayin in the previous share, I'm going to start Siman Tov Reish Lamed Zayin over again because we did it very quickly and we left a couple of stones unturned, and I don't like doing that. So we're going to go back to the beginning of Siman Tov Reish Lamed Zayin, bottom of Kuf Amid Aleph, Din Sukkah She'ula or Gezula, the halachas that pertain to a borrowed sukkah or a stolen sukkah, a sukkah that does not belong to you. Ubay Gimel Se'ifim, and here we have 3 Se'ifim. And like I pointed out yesterday, before the Mechaber is really going to start discussing the Sukkah She'ula specifically, or the Sukkah Gzula specifically, he has to lay sort of the groundwork. So the Mechaber says here in Sif Aleph, if somebody did not have the opportunity to make a sukkah, maybe he was a shaygig, he wasn't able to make a sukkah, or even if b'mezid, he did not make a sukkah. So maybe at the beginning of sukkahs he did not have a sukkah. He could build a sukkah during Chol HaMoed, afilu b'soif yom shvi, and he can do this even at the end of the 7th day of Sukkot. The 7th day of Sukkot is really the last day of Chol HaMoed, and then comes Shmini Atzeres. So all the way at the end of Sukkot, he could still go ahead and make a sukkah if he still needs a sukkah. And similarly, the halacha is a person does not have to use the same sukkah for the entire 7 days of Yom Tov. He could move from one sukkah to another sukkah. So, what we have to understand over here, and I mentioned this yesterday, but we're going to go over it again, is that the pasuk tells us Chag HaSukkah is Taseh Lecha Shivas Yomim. You have to make a sukkah, Taseh, you have to make a sukkah, and the pasuk says Shivas Yomim. Pasuk says you have to make a sukkah for 7 days. The question is, what do we learn out from this, that you have to make a sukkah for 7 days? If you look at the Taz says both the Chachamim and Rebbe Eliezer, who argue about this, neither one of them wanted to understand the pasuk as saying that for 7 days every day you have to go ahead and make a sukkah for scratch specifically for that day. Nobody was nachis to take that position. However, we do have a machlokes in the Brisa between Rebbe Eliezer and the Chachamim. Rebbe Eliezer understands the pasuk, and he says, when we see Chagat Sukkah is Taseh Lecha Shivas Yomim, the implication is that you need to make a 7-day sukkah. That means you have to make a sukkah before the onset of Sukkot, and you have to have that same sukkah for 7 days. You can't jump from one sukkah to another sukkah. Not only can you not jump from one sukkah to another sukkah, you also can't go ahead and make a sukkah on day 5. If you make a sukkah on day 5 of Sukkot, that's not a sukkah Shivas Yomim. That's not a 7-day sukkah. It's only going to be a 2-day sukkah. You can't make a 2-day sukkah. You have to make a 7-day sukkah. That's the opinion of Rebbe Eliezer. The Chachamim look at it. The Chachamim say, no, that's not at all what it means. What it means is Chag HaSukkah is Taseh Lecha Shivas Yomim. It means that there's a 7-day Chag, and during that 7-day Chag, make a sukkah whenever you need one. You need a sukkah, go ahead and make a sukkah. So according to the Chachamim, the pasuk is actually telling you, you could go ahead and make a sukkah in the middle of Sukkot. According to Rebbe Eliezer, no. The sukkah has to be a 7-day sukkah. If it's not a 7-day sukkah, it's not usable as a sukkah. So you can't eat in one sukkah on the first day and the next sukkah on the second day. It's not a 7-day sukkah. You got to use the same sukkah all 7 days. Comes the Mechaber over here, and the Mechaber is telling me, we paskin clearly like the Chachamim. If you didn't have a sukkah, you can make a sukkah at any point during Yom Tov that you want. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cut in Aleph. The Mechaber made the point that this halacha is true whether the fact that you didn't have a sukkah was due to a shaygeg or due to a mezid. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ashmeinon, what the Mechaber wants to teach me here is, Shaloi kansuhu avor zeh. You might have thought if somebody b'mezid, b'shat nefesh, somebody didn't go ahead and make a sukkah, maybe now we give him a knas. We tell him you You went ahead b'mezid. You didn't go ahead and prepare a sukkah for yourself. Now you want to have a sukkah. No, you have a knas. You can't make a sukkah. Says the mechaber, no, that's not the halacha. Even b'mezid, you could still make a sukkah during Yom Tov. V'choshkein, certainly im naflo sukkasai b'Yom Tov. If a hurricane came along and blew down your sukkah, certainly you could make one during Chalamayid. Like I explained yesterday, even Rebbe Eliezer agrees that if you did make a sukkah, remember, according to Rebbe Eliezer, you need to make a 7-day sukkah. But even Rebbe Eliezer agrees, if somebody made a sukkah before Yom Tov, and during Yom Tov his sukkah blew down, he could go ahead and he could rebuild the sukkah, because that's a continuation and a reconstruction of the old sukkah, and that is continuing the 7-day sukkah. That does not mean that you're going ahead now and making a new sukkah, which is not a 7-day sukkah. So even Rebbe Eliezer would agree to this halacha, that if your sukkah fell down, you could go make a new one. Uve Yom Tov asar lahakima. However, on Yom Tov, the Chavetz Chaim says, realize that on Yom Tov you're not allowed to build a sukkah. Now that's very easily understood. On Yom Tov you're not allowed to build a sukkah because of the malacha of boineh. You're not allowed to build a structure on Yom Tov. So on Yom Tov you cannot go ahead and build a sukkah. On Chalamayid you could build a sukkah, but on Yom Tov you cannot build a sukkah. Now comes along the Chavetz Chaim, and we dealt with this only very briefly yesterday, and I want to expand upon it. This is one of the main reasons why I went back. Says the Chavetz Chaim, "Va'afilu im haruach hipel mimena rak miktsas min haschach levad." Let's say the wind came along and it blew off a small portion of your schach, and you want to go ahead and you want to put a little bit of schach back up on top of the sukkah. Ein lahaisif b'yom tov ba'atzmai. Says the Chavetz Chaim, you should not go and replace that schach by yourself on Yom Tov. Why? What's the problem over here? Well, we know that the halacha is, if you look back in Hilchos Shabbos, it's Siman Shin Tes Vav, and you take a look at the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Yud Gimel. We know that you're not allowed to be moisif on a binyan. If you have a binyan kavua, if you have a structure, a permanent structure, and now you want to go add to it on Shabbos or on Yom Tov, you're not allowed to do that. That would be usher because of boinu. But if you have some kind of an oyel aroi, if you have a temporary structure that is already built, and you want to add on a little bit to an oyel aroi, you want to add a temporary oil to a temporary oil, that really you're allowed to do. However, over here, it's still usher. Even though the sukkah, really, you look at a sukkah, you'll say a sukkah is a diras aroi, it's not a diras kva. Why can't you just go put up a small amount of schach? The schach is already there, so you're not creating a new oil, you're being moisif an oil by an oil aroi. You know what this is similar to? This is very similar to what many of us do on our sukkahs all the time, on Yom Tov when we have a shlak. If you have a shlak on the sukkah, but the shlak is closed at least a tefach before Yom Tov, now you're allowed to roll out the shlak and you're allowed to close the shlak. Why are you allowed to close the shlak? Because you're being moisif an oil aroi on an existing oil aroi. That's not a problem. So why is it a problem to go put back schach up on top of a sukkah that's already mesuchach, it already has schach on it? It seems that the problem over here is, if you look at the Shailu Meshiv brings down, the reason for this is because even though the sukkah might have a din of a diras aroi, since it's something that you built l'shem mitzvah, and it's an oil that allows you to be mekayim the mitzvah of sukkah, it has an added chashivus, and it has an added kvius. And that's why you're not even allowed to be moisif on it. You're not even allowed to replace the schach that blew down. Okay, so that's one halacha the Chavetz Chaim says. If a small amount of the schach blew down, you're not allowed to replace it by yourself. Aber, says the Chavetz Chaim, Val Yidei Akum, if you want to use a non-Jew, if you want to instruct a non-Jew to do this, then, says the Chavetz Chaim, Afilu nafal haschach kuloi, even if the schach fell off the sukkah in its entirety, gamkein yesh lahatir. That you could also be matir. You could instruct a non-Jew to totally cover your sukkah with schach on sukkahs. Now, why is that mutter? L'char, that's binyan midaraisa. If that's aser als boine min HaTorah, why are you allowed to do amira la'akum on this? We paskin that you're not allowed to do Amir La'akum even b'makom mitzvah on a daraisa. You're allowed to do Amir La'akum on a darabanon, but Amir La'akum on a daraisa? Why are you allowed to do that? So what the Mefarshim say over here, and this is brought down in the Shar Tzion, it's brought down in the name of the Be'er Yitzchak, that what we're doing over here is we're being mitzaref, we're joining two different kulas together. And by joining the two kulas together, we arrive at this psak. What are the two kulas? So first of all, we have the famous sheet of the Baal HaItur. The Itur holds that you're allowed to do Amira La'akum on a Daraisa b'makom mitzvah. You're always allowed to do Amira La'akum on a Daraisa b'makom mitzvah. That's the sheet of the Baal HaItur. Usually we don't paskin like the Baal HaItur. But in this case, we're going to be mitzaref another shita together with the shita of the Baal HaItur, and that is the shita of Tosfos. There's a famous shita of Tosfos. Tosfos holds that boina is not aser b'daraisa on Yom Tov. We know that we have a concept of mitoich. The concept of mitoich says mitoich that a malacha is mutter on Yom Tov litzarich eichel nefesh. It's also mutter shaloi litzarich eichel nefesh. Now, interestingly enough, we find a case where the malacha of boina is mutter litzarich eichel nefesh. Where is that case? Making cheese. Making cheese is usually aser on Shabbos or on Yom Tov because of the malacha of boina. Because what you're doing is you're taking something that was a liquid and you're firming it up, you're turning it into a solid, you're making a shape out of it, and that would really be aser because of boina. But on Yom Tov, l'tzarech eichel nefesh, you're allowed to make cheese. So Tosfos says, mitoich shehutra l'tzarech eichel nefesh, since we find a case where the malacha of boina is mutter l'tzarech eichel nefesh, it should also be mutter shaloi l'tzarech eichel nefesh, but midrabanan, boina is aser on Yom Tov. But in any case, it comes out, according to the shita of Tosfos, that there is no issa daraisa of boina on Yom Tov. Im Kain, having a non-Jew put the schach up for you on Yom Tov would never be an issa daraisa. The guy is not doing issa daraisa; he's doing issa darabanan. Well, now it's a shvus to shvus. The whole malacha of putting the schach up is only an issa boina midrabanan, according to Tosfos. Amir la'akum is a second darabanan. So now it's a shvus to shvus b'makom mitzvah. That certainly is mutter. A shvus to shvus b'makom mitzvah, we paskin is mutter. So we have, on one hand, we have the shita of Tosfos, who holds that this is a shvus to shvus b'makom mitzvah. On the other hand, we have the shita of the Baal HaItur, who holds that even if boina is taka aser midaraisa on Yom Tov, but since this is b'makom mitzvah, amir la'akum on a daraisa b'makom mitzvah is mutter. So by combining the Baal HaItur together with Tosfos, we arrive at this psak over here of the Chavetz Chaim, where the Chavetz Chaim says that you could ask a non-Jew to rebuild your sukkah. He could put up all of your schach. If all of your schach blew off, you could have a non-Jew go ahead and put all of your schach up on Yom Tov itself. Okay. It was kedai to go back just for this ice cotton aleph of the Mishnah Berurah to give a thorough understanding in this ice cotton. Okay, now let's go to ice cotton bays. The Mechaber told us that if you didn't make a sukkah, you could even make a sukkah b'soif Yom Shvi. All the way at the end of the 7th day of Yom Tov, you could still make a sukkah. Diksiv, what's behind this? Because it says in the pasuk, Chag HaSukkah Yistasa L'cha Shivas Yamin. And according to the Chachamim in the Brisa, I think it's on Chav Zayin Amid Beis in Sukkah, Hachi Kama Rachmana. This is what the Torah means to say with this pasuk. Asei Sukkah B'Chag, you should make a sukkah on Sukkos, Pirish Be'eze Yamim Mishivas Yamim Shetirtze. On any one of the 7 days that you need and you want to make a sukkah, you could make a sukkah. That's what the pasuk means. Chag HaSukkah Yistasa L'cha Shivas Yamim. You should make a sukkah during the Chag whenever you need to on any of the 7 days. Va'afilu b'yom hashvi, even on the very last day, even on the 7th day, im lo yosisa kaidem lochein, if you did not yet make a sukkah prior to the 7th day of Sukkot, according to the Chachamim, and that's the way we paskin, you're allowed to go ahead and make a sukkah. Continues the Chavetz Chaim, we're now on Kuf Amid Beis, ubein hashmoshois. Let's say it's the 7th day of Sukkot, which is the last day of Sukkot, Hoshana Rabbah, the last day of Sukkot, and now it's bein hashmoshos, going from the last day of Sukkot into Shmini Atzeres. Ubein hashmashas, by bein hashmashas, aser la'asoisa al yedei atzmai. You want to have a sukkah because you need a sukkah for Shmini Atzeres. So, Hoshana Rabbah is over. Sukkah, technically speaking, is over. Now we're going into Shmini Atzeres. You want to be able to eat in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. Let's remember that here in the Chutz La'aretz we have a Sveika D'Yoma. So Hoshana Rabbah and Shmini Atzeres, we have a Sveika D'Yoma on Shmini Atzeres. Is it Shmini Atzeres or is it really the 7th day of Sukkot? If it's really the 7th day of Sukkot, we have to eat in the Sukkah. That's why we eat in the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeres, Midrabanan, because of this problem of Sveika D'Yoma, Minig Aviseinu B'Yadenu. So now, it's Bein HaShmashas going from Hoshana Rabbah to Shmini Atzeres, and you don't have a Sukkah. So says the Chavetz Chaim, Bein HaShmashas, Asar La'asoisa Al Yedei Atzmai. You're not allowed to go ahead and build a Sukkah for Shmini Atzeres on your own on Yom Tov. Again, you can't do that because that's an Isser Daraisa. You have an Isser Daraisa of Baina. Set aside the sheet of Taisvis, who holds that Baina is only a Darabanan. We don't paskin, generally speaking, like Taisvis. So for us, Baina is an Isser Daraisa on Yom Tov. So you want to do an Isser Daraisa to go ahead and build a Sukkah, Ben Hashmashas, you're not allowed to do that. To have a Sveika Daraisa, it's a Safek Daraisa. Val Yidei Akum Shari Lasa. So what's the Safek Daraisa? The Safek Daraisa is a Safek, is it Hoshana Rabbah? If it's Hoshana Rabbah is Chalamayid. If it's Hoshana Rabbah, you're allowed to build the Sukkah. If it's really Shmini Atzeres, right? Because Ben Hashmashas is Safek Yom, Safek Laila. If it's Yom, it's still Hoshana Rabbah, it's still Chalamayid. You're allowed to go ahead and build the Sukkah. But if it's Shmini Atzeres, it's already Yom Tov. We paskin bainas in Issa Daraisa on Yom Tov. So it's a Sveika Daraisa whether or not you could build the Sukkah now. So you can't build it by yourself to have a Sveika Daraisa. Aber va'al yidei akum shari la'asoisa. However, you could go ahead and you could ask a non-Jew to do it. Now, this is very interesting. Why are you allowed to ask a non-Jew to do it? Well, we're talking about Bein Hashmashas. Again, it's Safek Yom, Safek Laila. If it's Yom, it's Hoshana Rabbah, it's Chalamayid, building the Sukkah is Mutter. If it's Laila, it's already Shmini Atzeres, it's Yom Tov, building the Sukkah is an Issa Daraisa. But we paskin that during Bein Hashmashas, you're allowed to do Amir La'akum even on a Daraisa b'Makom Mitzvah. I mentioned earlier the sheet of the Baal HaIter. The Iter holds that even on Yom Tov proper, you're allowed to do Amir La'akum on a Daraisa b'Makom Mitzvah. We don't paskin like the Iter on Yom Tov. But Bein Hashmashas, on Bein Hashmashas we hold you're allowed to do Amir La'akum even on a Daraisa b'Makom Mitzvah. And you could see this earlier on in Siman Reish Samach Aleph in the Mishnah Berurah in Sif Aleph, in the Mechaber in Sif Aleph. I think I have it handy here. I can tell you, I could even read it to you. Reish Samach Aleph. Reish Samach Aleph. Safek Chashecha, V'hu Bein Hashmashos. When it's Safek Yom, Safek Laila, which means the time period of Bein Hashmashos. I'm going to skip the Ramah for now. Ein ma'asrin es avadai, ve'ein matbilin es hakelim, ve'ein matlikin es haneris, ve'ein ma'arvin eruve tchumin. But, says the Mechaber, umuter loymar le'eino Yehudi, you're allowed to instruct a non-Jew, Bein Hashmashos, lahadlik ner l'tzarech Shabbos. V'chein loymar loy lases kol malacha shehi l'tzarech mitzvah, oishu tarid v'nechbaz aleha. So you have clearly here in the Mechaber, you're allowed to instruct a non-Jew to do malacha, even malacha daraisa, like havara, b'makom mitzvah, Bein Hashmashos. So now, this is definitely a tzarech mitzvah, because midrabanan you have to eat in the sukkah on Shmini Atzeres. So you need the sukkah, so you're allowed to instruct the non-Jew to do a malacha daraisa of baina during Bein Hashmashos of the 7th day of Hoshana Rabbah going into Shmini Atzeres. You can instruct the non-Jew to go ahead and build a sukkah for you. Okay, that's very straightforward, and that seems very easy to understand. But here's an interesting question. What did the Chavetz Chaim just tell me here? The Chavetz Chaim just told me, Bein Hashmashos, Safek Yom, Safek Laila, Hoshana Rabbah going into Shmini Atzeres, since it's a Safek, that's when we paskin and we say that you're allowed to do Amir La'akim even on a Daraisa b'Makom Mitzvah. But we just had on the bottom of Kuf Amud Aleph where the Mishnah Berurah told me that Val Yidei Akum Afilu Nafal Aschach Kula Gam Ken Yesh Lahatir. We opened up the shir where the Mishnah Berurah told me on the previous page in Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Aleph that on Yom Tov, not Ben Hashmashas, on Yom Tov, you're always allowed to instruct a non-Jew to go ahead and replace your schach for you. So here on Kuf Amud Aleph in Mishnah Berurah is Katan Aleph, the Mishnah Berurah tells me, even on Yom Tov itself, I could go instruct a non-Jew to do the Issa Daraisa of Baineh to put my schach back on top of my sukkah. And here on Kuf Amud Beis, the Chavetz Chaim comes and tells me, Bein Hashmoshes of Hoshana Rabbah, going into Shmini Atzeres, you can instruct a guy to build a sukkah for you. Why? Because it's Amira La'akum, Bein Hashmoshes, on a Daraisa, B'Makom Mitzvah, that's mutter. What do you mean? You just told me even on Yom Tov itself, I could instruct a non-Jew to go build a sukkah for me. So what's the difference between Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Aleph and over here in Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Beis? And the answer is that there's really a critical difference. What did I tell you in Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Aleph? I told you that over there we're being mitzaref two shitas. Over there we're being mitzaref the sheet of the Bala Iter and the sheet of Tosfos. The Bala Iter holds that you're always allowed to do Amira La'akam on a Daraisa b'Makom Mitzvah. But the Bala Iter wouldn't apply over here in our case. In our case, we're talking about Shmini Atzeres. Shmini Atzeres, there's no mitzvah aseim in HaTorah to eat in a sukkah. Shmini Atzeres is a Darabanan. The only reason we're eating in the Sukkah on Shmini Atzeres is because of a Darabanan of Sveika Diyuma and Minig Aviseinu B'Yadeinu. So we can't be mitzaref the sheet of the Bala Iter. The Bala Iter wouldn't be matir over here, Amir La'akum on a Daraisa b'Makom Mitzvah. So we don't have the Bala Iter over here. Since we don't have the Bala Iter over here, the only reason this is mutter is because it's Ben Hashmashas. And Ben Hashmashas, we always paskin that you're allowed to do Amir La'akam on the Daraisa b'Makom Mitzvah. The same heter that we had previously wouldn't apply over here on Shmini Atzeres if it wasn't Ben Hashmashas. If it was already past nightfall of Shmini Atzeres, we wouldn't be matter you to instruct a guy to put up the sukkah. Because we can't be mitzaref the sheet of the Bala Iter. The Bala Iter wouldn't be matter it now. On Shmini Atzeres, there's no mitzvah saseh with daraisa to eat in the sukkah. It's only a darabanan. So over there, the Bala Iter wouldn't be matir Amir La'akam on a daraisa. He wouldn't say that it's called b'Makom Mitzvah. So on Shmini Atzeres, we wouldn't be able to give you the heter of Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Aleph. So the only reason it's mutter now is because we're not talking about on Shmini Atzeres. We're talking about Ben Hashmashas going into Shmini Atzeres. Okay. Continues the Chavetz Chaim 3 lines down in the Mishnah Berurah over here. Gershen is gayer b'soich yemei hachag. Gershen is gayer b'zman abayis. A ger who becomes a ger in the middle of Sukkot. Oisa sukkah b'mei hachag hanoisarim. He could go ahead and he could construct a sukkah for himself. Because again, the fact that he didn't have a sukkah before then, he wasn't chayiv in sukkah before then. He's first chayiv in sukkah now. He could go ahead and he could build himself a sukkah for the remaining days of Yom Tov. Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Gimel, the Mechaber told us that you're allowed to go out from one sukkah and then use another sukkah. Yachol, says the Chavetz Chaim, Ashmi'inon, the Mechaber is teaching me here, Deloi be'inon she has sukkah l'shivas yamim dafka. Again, the Mechaber is telling me another manifestation of the fact that we paskin like the Chachamim. We paskin like the Chachamim, so you don't need a 7-day sukkah. So if you made one sukkah for the first day of Yom Tov, now you want to go somewhere else and you want to use a different sukkah for the second day, for the third day, and then you want to go somewhere else and use a different sukkah for the fourth day and the fifth day, not a problem. Ois Katan Daled, V'lei shev ba'acheres, v'chein is similarly, Yachal lechol bezu, you can have an eating sukkah, v'lishon bezu, and have a sleeping sukkah. I know several people who have that. They have 2 different sukkahs. I know somebody has a beautiful sukkah on the porch off his master bedroom, and that's where he goes to sleep on Sukkot. But that's not the eating sukkah. The eating sukkah is downstairs on the deck. Okay, now we go to Sif Beis. Says the Mechaber. Top line, Kuf Amud Beis. Yoitzin b'sukkah she'ula. You could be yoitza the mitzvah of sukkah with a borrowed sukkah. The sukkah does not have to be yours. Now, before I could read the next phrase. V'chein yotzin mishal shutvis. Similarly, you could be yotze the mitzvah of sukkah with a sukkah that you have a partnership in. Okay, what's at play over here? Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in hay. She'ula. You could use a borrowed sukkah diksiv because it says in the pasuk, Kol ha'ezrach b'Yisrael yeshvu basukkos. All of Klal Yisrael should eat in sukkos. Now, even though the word sukkos technically is a lashon rabim, Kol ha'ezrach b'Yisrael yeshvu basukkos, in many sukkos, if you look at the word, you'll notice that it is spelled chosar. It's spelled missing the vav between the kaf and the saf. And therefore you could read it basukas, which would be a lashon yochid, one sukkah. Therefore the Gemara tells us that according to the Chachamim, the implication of this pasuk is that theoretically Gans Klal Yisrael could be yotza by using one sukkah. Like the Chavetz Chaim says, Melame, this teaches me, Shekol Yisrael Ru'uyin Leishev B'Sukkah Achas. V'hainu Zeh Achar Zeh. Technically speaking, Gans Klal Yisrael could be yotze the mitzvah of Sukkah using one Sukkah. One family will go in, and then another family will go in, and then another family will go in. They'll take turns using the Sukkah. V'zeh I efshar sheyeh l'chulan, and the Chavetz Chaim says, it's not possible that this sukkah belongs to Gans Klal Yisrael. Because if you're talking about Gans Klal Yisrael having a shutvis in one sukkah, that would not be a valid shutvis. This is a quote from Rashi in Masechta Sukkah. Rashi says, Gans Klal Yisrael would not eat, every member of Klal Yisrael would not be able to have ownership of a shava pruta of this sukkah. The sukkah is not valuable enough for every member of Klal Yisrael to have ownership of a shava pruta. And if you don't have ownership over a shava pruta, then your ownership is not considered an ownership. So you see from this limud that you're not mechuyev to use a sukkah that's yours. Ella al yedei she'ela. It must be that when Gans Klal Yisrael is using one sukkah, somebody owns it, or maybe there's a group of people who own it. Everybody else is only using it as a borrowed sukkah. So you see that you're allowed to use a borrowed sukkah. And similarly, you could be yotze using a sukkah that's owned in a partnership. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Kal v'chomer mishe'ula. So this is a Kal v'chomer. If you're allowed to use a borrowed sukkah in which you have no ownership, certainly you're allowed to use a sukkah that you have a share of ownership in. Okay, now we go to Siv Gimel. Well, we have a little bit of a balancing act over here. On the one hand, we have a pasuk that says, Chag HaSukkos Taseh Lecha. You should make a sukkah that is yours. Now we know that by Daled Minim, we darshan the pasuk uses the word lachem in the context of Daled Minim, or lakachtem lachem. You should take for yourselves. And the Gemara darshans from the word lachem that your lulav and your esrig, your adasim, your aravas, all your Daled Minim, in order for you to be yotze the mitzvah of Daled Minim, those Daled Minim have to belong to you. You're not allowed to be yotze the mitzvah with Daled Minim to belong to somebody else. Now, for us, this is negeah only on the first day, when we have a chiyuv daraisa of Daled Minim. So on the first day, we're very makbid. It has to be lochem. It has to belong to you. That's why we have all of these shilas that always come up. If you have to use somebody else's, he has to give it to you as a matana manas la'achzir. And you run into all sorts of trouble. What happens if you want to give the Daled Minim to your child, to your minor child, to a cotton, to use to be yotze the mitzvah? He doesn't have das makneh. He can't give it back to you on a matana manas la'achzir. So you have to make sure to be yotze the mitzvah on your own first, before you give it to him to allow him to be yotze the mitzvah, because he can't give it back to you and then it's no longer lachem. So you see a precedent for this type of drasha. We darshan l'kachtem lachem. The Daled Minim must be yours. Now by Sukkot also, it says Chag HaSukkos Taseh Lecha. So you might have thought to darshan that lecha, the sukkah, has to be yours. But we just saw here in Siv Beis that we don't make that drasha. We say you're allowed to use a sukkah she'ula. Right? You're allowed to use a borrowed sukkah. That sukkah is certainly not lecha. It's not yours. You have permission to use it, but it's not yours. So you see that according to the Chachamim, we're not darshaning the word lecha that you have to have ownership. However, we do have a drasha in the Gemara where it says Chag HaSukkah is tasa lecha. The lecha is limud sukkah gezula. We do use the word lecha to exclude a stolen sukkah. A stolen sukkah you're not allowed to use. The question becomes, what constitutes a stolen sukkah? What is the stolen sukkah that you're not allowed to use? And what is considered a sukkah that might not be yours, but it's also not stolen? Maybe you're using it without permission, but it's not stolen. And therefore you can be yotze the mitzvah, even though it's not yours, but it doesn't have to be yours. We learned that from Kala Ezrak B'Yisrael Yeshvu Basukais. So we know that it doesn't have to be yours. It just can't be stolen. So in order for it to be a problem, it has to be considered a stolen sukkah. And as we're going to see, there are sukkahs that you might not have permission to use, but they're not considered to be stolen. And therefore you could be yotze the mitzvah. So now let's take a look here at Siv Gimel. Says the Machaber, Sukkah gezula keshera. A stolen sukkah is kosher. Now the Mishnah Berurah jumps all over this right away. Go to Mishnah Berurah's Cotton Zion. The Mishnah Berurah says, Eina loshen medukta kolkach. The wording over here, the phraseology, is not really 100% precise. Because, like I just told you, we do darshan from the pasuk of Chag HaSukkah is tasa lecha that it has to be lecha and not gezula. It cannot be a stolen sukkah. So this statement of the Mechaber that sukkah gezula keshera is not really 100% precise. Ella says the B'chavetz Chaim Ritzayin Loimar. What the Mechaber wants to say is the gezula kehai, a stolen sukkah of the type that the Mechaber is about to describe. Shetakav al chaveroi v'itzioi, where you went into somebody else's sukkah and you forcibly removed him from the sukkah and you took over the sukkah keshera. That type of sukkah gezula is kosher. You could be yotze with that type of sukkah gezula, but not every type of sukkah gezula. Now, how come you could be yotze with that type of sukkah gezula? So let's go weiter. Let's take a look. So again, Siv Gimel in the Mechaber, sukkah gezula keshera, a stolen sukkah is kosher. Which kind of stolen sukkah is kosher? Ketzad. What's the case? Because certainly we know the Gemara darshins that a sukkah gzula is puzzle. So what do you mean a sukkah gzula is kshera? Ketzad. What's the case that I'm talking about? Explains the Mechaber. Im takaf al chaveroi. If you forced yourself on your friend, va'itziai misukasai, and you expelled him from his sukkah, ugizala, and you stole it. What does it mean you stole it? You took over possession of the sukkah, so to speak. You evicted him from the sukkah, and you sat down and you're having a lovely meal inside somebody else's sukkah. So that is a form of a sukkah gzula. You evicted the owner and you took it over. Yotza, in that case you are yotza. Why are you yotza? Explains the Mechaber, she'ein hakarka nigzeles. Because the halacha is that karka, real estate, cannot be stolen. What does it mean to steal real estate? You have a field. A field is sitting there on the ground. It's not metaltalin. It's not movable. You can't take the field and bring it into your house. You cannot take the field and bring it into your property. The field, it was there, it is there, and it will continue to be there. And it is becheskas baila. It still belongs to its true owner. You are not allowing him to use it. You are taking over usage of it, but it's not considered stolen. Karka ain't an exelis. Real estate cannot be stolen. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is katneches. She'ena karka exelis. Explains the Chavetz Chaim. The chola mechuber lekarka harehu kekarka. Whatever is attached to the ground has the same halacha as karka. The fact that you took it over, it is still owned by the original owner. And you didn't remove it from his property and take it into your property. You can't remove it. It's real estate. And the sukkah too, even though the sukkah might be made out of wooden panels, it's considered mechuber lekarka. It is founded on the ground. It's mechuber lekarka. and therefore it is the same din as karka. V'chishu'ula dam yelididei. And as far as this person who's now sitting in it and eating a lovely meal, he has no permission to be doing so, but halachically, it is no different than a sukkah she'ula. In Sif Beis, we told you that a sukkah she'ula, you could be yaitza. Why? Because you don't need the sukkah to be lecha. We don't need you to have ownership of the sukkah. Right? So over here also, it's true you don't own the sukkah, but this does not constitute a sukkah gzula. It does not meet the halachic requirements to be called stolen, because karka is ein exelis, and therefore we can't be memayed it from lecha limud gzula, because it's not stolen. It's not yours. Okay, it's not yours. So it's like a sukkah shula. Sukkah shula is also not yours, and still you could be yaitz in the mitzvah. So to over here you could be yaitz in the mitzvah. That's the mechaber. Now let's take a look at the Ramah. Says the Ramah, Mihu, however, lechatchila lo yeshev adam b'sukas chaveroi shaloi midaitoi. A person lechatchila should not use somebody else's sukkah. Now the word shaloi midaitoi mean without his knowledge. I think from the Chavetz Chaim it's going to become clear that in this context it means without his consent. Let's take a look in the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is cut and test. Shaloi midaitoi. You should not use somebody else's sukkah either without his knowledge or without his consent. Let's see what the Mishnah Berurah says. What's the problem over here? The problem is Shema bala sukkah hu makbid al zeh. Maybe the owner of the sukkah has a hakpada. He doesn't want you sitting in his sukkah using his sukkah. What would the hakpada be? Says the Chavetz Chaim, Shelo yireh chavero yes hasakov. This person doesn't want you to see what he's doing. He doesn't want you to see what he's eating. He's not interested in you coming in while he's sitting and eating a meal, and you're going to go out and say, wow, you should see the cowboy steak that Yena was eating. He was eating this cowboy steak, 2.5 inches thick, prime, on a long bone. That thing had to be $69 a pound if it was a penny. Now we all know that Yankel Shmuel is a rich man. He's not interested. He's sitting in his sukkah. He doesn't want you coming in and watching him eating his meal. He doesn't want you to see what he's doing in his sukkah. Maybe he's doing something else in the sukkah. Dirshu came to Dirshu. We're supposed to spend as much time as possible in the sukkah. He's not interested in you coming into his house, right? On Sukkot, this is technically speaking his house. He doesn't want you sitting over there. Now this is why I was tempted to translate Shaloi midaitoi without his consent, not without his knowledge. Because clearly the Chavetz Chaim is understanding over here that this fellow knows that you're in his sukkah. He's sitting there. The Chavetz Chaim is telling you, you know why lechatchila you're not supposed to use the sukkah without his consent? Because he doesn't want you to watch what he's eating. He doesn't want you to watch what he's doing. If he's not there, he doesn't see what you're doing. You don't see what he's doing. You don't see what he's eating. So shaloi midaitoi does not mean without his knowledge. He has knowledge that you're there. It means without his consent. So don't come in and use somebody else's sukkah without his consent. Umemela, says the Chavetz Chaim, once the Ramah tells you that lechatchila you should not use somebody else's sukkah without his consent, ein nachain levarech aleha. If you go ahead and you use the sukkah, it would not be proper for you to make a bracha on that sukkah. Now this is very interesting. Why aren't we making a bracha? It would seem from the Magen Avram, the reason why we're not making a bracha, because let's remember, you are being yaitz to the mitzvah, because it's not a sukkah gzula. Also, not only are you being yaitz to the mitzvah, you can't call it a mitzvah abba ba'avera. You didn't, technically speaking, you didn't do an avera. If karka ain't an exelis, if you cannot call the sukkah to be a stolen sukkah, then really we can't say that you did an avera. You didn't do an avera. But yet, since it's not proper for you to be doing what you're doing, since it's not right for you to be doing what you're doing over here, because you're doing it without the owner's consent, you're inconveniencing the owner, and we hold that this is not right, what you're doing, this falls under the rubric of Baitzea Berech Ni'etzes Hashem. This is not something that you should be making a bracha on. You're doing something that's wrong, and therefore you're not maskir the Shem Shamayim. You don't make a bracha on what you're doing. Aval, however, continues the Chavetz Chaim, muter likanes v'leishe b'sukas chaveroi. You are allowed to go use your friend's sukkah, B'shah she'ein bala sukkah sham b'sukkasei. If you know that your neighbor is not in his sukkah, you want to sit down and eat a meal on sukkah. Something happened to your sukkah was destroyed, you don't have a sukkah, and now you want to go eat something on sukkah. Your friend's sukkah, your neighbor's sukkah, is sitting right over there next door to you, it's wide open, and you know that they're not home. Says the Chavetz Chaim, mutter likanis v'leisha b'sukkahs chavera b'shah she'ein bala sukkah sham b'sukkasei. Shebevadai lo yakbid al zeh. Because certainly he's not going to be makbid. Because like the Chazal say in many other places, a person is very happy that mitzvahs should be done with his money and with his property. So your neighbor is going to be very happy that you're coming and using his sukkah and being yotzei mitzvah. His zicha would have no hakpada. Nevertheless, the Chavetz Chaim does say, if there's a reasonable possibility that the owner is going to come back while you're sitting and enjoying his sukkah, after be'esa knisa eino sham, even though he's not there when you first go into the sukkah to sit down to eat, then you should not go in without his knowledge. Why? Because it's very nice that he's happy for you to use the sukkah while he's not there. But what we're afraid of over here is you went in to use Yankel Shmerel's sukkah while Yankel Shmerel was away on a Chalamoid trip. But now Yankel Shmerel is going to come home, and really he's hungry, and he wants to sit down and he wants to have a coffee and a piece of cake inside his sukkah. But he's nisbayish. He doesn't want to go into the sukkah while you're there. So now he's going to wait until you leave. And for that reason, you cannot use the sukkah even if the guy is not there, if there's a reasonable chance that he might come while you're still there. Kasa beBikur Yaakov, the Bikur Yaakov writes, if you received permission from your neighbor's wife to use the sukkah while he's not there, nira de mahani, that is efficacious. The Kevin de Hirshase Ishtai, since his wife gave you permission, Mistama lo yakbid al zeh, he's not going to be makbid, the owner is not going to be makbid on the permission that his wife gave. Okay. Now let's go weiter in the Ramah. So the Ramah said, Kolshkein certainly, says the Ramah, im daitoi legozla. Certainly you shouldn't use your friend's sukkah if your intent in using it is really an intent of gezel, that you really want to steal it. V'chein, similarly, says the Ramah, lo yasa sukkah lechatchila bekarka shel chaveroi shaloi midaitoi. You should not put up your sukkah on your friend's land without his consent. V'chein bekarka shehi shel rabim. This is a very, very interesting halacha. V'chein bekarka shehi shel rabim. And you also should not put up a sukkah on public property. Miu b'di eved yotza. But if you did, b'di eved, you would be yotza. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Yud. Shehi shel rabim. You should not erect a sukkah on public property. Kasav Magen Avram, the Magen Avram writes, v'tzarech iyun. This halacha needs a lot of iyun. V'tzarech iyun shenagu k'tzas lasei sukkah b'rishos harabim. A lot of people do have the minhag to make their sukkah in rishos harabim. They go out on the sidewalk and they make their sukkah on a piece of the sidewalk. And if you want to use an argument, what's the problem? I'm using the sidewalk. Everybody who lives over here, all the Yidden are meichel. They don't mind if I use the sidewalk. But that sukkah doesn't belong to the Yidden in Borough Park and Flatbush. It belongs to the Goyim also. And the Magen Avram comes out that you're not allowed to make a sukkah in Rishos Harabim. Because the non-Jews aren't moichel to you. They're not just giving you their permission to go make a sukkah on their Rishos Harabim. V'afta b'di'evet k'sheira, and even though you want to that b'di'evet it is kosher, mikamakom lo yivarech aleha, still says the Magen Avram, you cannot make a bracha to have a bracha of HaTorah. Because this bracha, says the Magen Avram, would constitute a bracha of HaTorah. This Magen Avram is very, very machmir. This Magen Avram is very interesting. Magen Avram is very, very makbid over here. And he's drawing this really from a mechaber later in Taf Mem Tes. Taf Reish Mem Tes. Taf Reish Mem Tes. Sif Aleph, I believe it is. The Mechaber says, Kol arba haminim psulim begazol ubeganov. The arba minim, like I said earlier, we darshu lo kaktem lochem, you're not allowed to use daled minim that are stolen. But the Mechaber says, however, aval gazol ukinoi, if you stole it and now you made a kinyan in it and now it's technically yours. Kigoy gazal lulav ishipahu. For example, you stole a lulav and then you sanded it down and you made it nice and smooth and pretty. Now you were kinda that object because you were kinda it with shinoi maisa. You did an act to it that is effective as a kinyan on a stolen object, and now technically it belongs to you. The kaneu b'shinoi maisa. So on that lulav you could be yotze the mitzvah. However, says the Mechaber, umihu loy yevarich alav. However, you're not allowed to make a bracha on it. And the Mishnah Berurah says, in Ois Katan Vav, it's on Kuf Yud Tesam and Beis if you want to see it. Kevad shemetchila begazel bali yadai. Since originally this lulav came to you through theft, even though now you acquired it because of your shina maisa, but it came to you through theft, machmerinon le'inyan bracha de ispa askara shem shamayim. We're very makbid that you can't be masker shem shamayim by tzeh berach ni'etzes Hashem. You can't be masker shem shamayim over this lulav that originally came to you through theft, even though you are now kind of with shina maisa. Okay, so the Magen Avram pulls from there, and he says, l'chayr, it's very similar over here. Over here too, he says the bottom line is, this sukkah that you're building on the property of the rabbim, even though you want to say karka ein an nigzeles, technically speaking, it's not stolen. Well, that lulav is also not stolen. The lulav that you smoothed down is also not stolen, but it came to you through theft. So too over here, when we're talking about a sukkah that you build on the karka of the rabbim, or in the previous Mishnah Berurah Katan Tes, when you're talking about a sukkah that you're using improperly, without the consent of the owner, you can't be masker shem shamayim on these kinds of sukkahs. So says the Magen Avram. But let's continue Mishnah Berurah Katan Yud over here. That's the sheet of the Magen Avram. However, Ube'eliyah Rabbah Kasav, the Eliyah Rabbah writes, the bracha of Atola loy heavy. We're not going to go so far as to call it a bracha of Atola. Ayin sham sheherich bazeh. And therefore, if you don't have a different sukkah, only this sukkah that was built on the karka of the rabbim, you can make a bracha. Shalom wants to say that the sukkah right outside your house, the sidewalk right outside your house, actually belongs to you. Document certainly if you have a shtar, if you have a document from the government that gives you permission to make an erev, to make sukkahs, I wanted to do this bir halacha because this is very negaya to us. We have restaurants that make sukkahs in the Rishos HaRabim. You have shuls that make sukkahs in the Rishos HaRabim. So this is very negaya to us. B'yas Hashem, tomorrow we'll take a look at this bir halacha dibra maschel v'chein bekarka shehi shel rabim. Okay, thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be Megan Agals Klal Yisrael. The Baruch should send Yeshua for Ruzah Parnasah to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to see the Geula Shlema b'meher of Yameinu. Amen. Be well.